They began as misfit Southern California teens who loved British heavy metal, and they went on to spearhead a musical movement that would change the very landscape of rock and roll. So here's the story and the locations behind what launched the biggest, and some say the greatest heavy metal band ever, Metallica. So we're about 10 miles south of downtown LA, almost on the Orange County border, and this is Downey, California. And among other things, Downey has the oldest operating McDonald's in the world. It's also home to the Apollo space program, was the original home to it. And musically, it's given us the likes of Karen and Richard Carpenter, Phil and Dave Alvin from the Blasters, and none other than James Hetfield of Metallica. In 1981, James was an angsty 18-year-old raised in a home of strict Christian Scientists. It's a religion where you're not allowed to see doctors. All healing comes through prayer. His parents were long divorced, and his mother had recently passed away. Anyways, at the time, he was listening to stuff like, Black Sabbath and Kiss, and he played guitar in a local Downey band called Leather Charm, whose bassist was Ron McGovney, and James at the time was living with Ron McGovney and his family. James and Ron had recently soundproofed the McGovney garage so they could rehearse in it, and James was now writing some original songs, and he answered an ad in the Recycler placed by a very young, very inexperienced drummer who had a strange accent and a very big dream. Dave Mustaine was a couple years older and had a lot more in common with James Hetfield than just a love of heavy music. They both shared eerily similar upbringings, strict religious, single parent, extremely dysfunctional families. Before they met, Dave lived here in Huntington Beach, where he worked at a gas station and had played in a couple of local metal outfits, one of them being the band Panic. But after a tragic accident had killed their drummer Mike Leftwich, it left the uber self-assured Dave Mustaine looking for a new band, and he answered an ad in the Recycler put in there by a drummer who was looking for like-minded musicians that were into sax and King Diamond and an English band called Budgie. So at the time, Lars Ulrich was a 18-year-old recent transplant from Denmark. He was a struggling professional tennis player and a wannabe drummer. And he was living with his parents at this upscale Newport Beach tennis-centric community called Park Newport. It's said that Lars could talk anybody into anything, and for my money, he was the mastermind behind the Metallica machine. But he was a networker before there was really a word for networker, and he was very into the whole new wave of British heavy metal movement. As a matter of fact, I think he was probably the only person in Orange County that could tell you what the initials stood for. But he loved bands like Motorhead and Iron Maiden and a little-known British band called Budgie. And Budgie would prove to be the linchpin in forming a bond with Dave Mustaine. Dave had never met a person before that was into Budgie the way that he was. Now, at this point, Lars's rap far outstripped his ability behind the drum kit, but he told Dave Mustaine he'd been jamming with a couple guys up in Downey, and he invited him to come and check it out. So this is Norwalk, and it's a gritty working class part of LA County that borders Downey, and the rehearsal space in Ron McGovney's garage sat on what is now under the Century Freeway. And interestingly, about 5 miles down the Century Freeway was another very famous rehearsal space that was paved over by the freeway also. And that, of course, was the Wilson Brothers and the Beach Boys, although they do have a plaque on theirs. So by 1982, Lars, James, and Ron McGovney, who was an aspiring rock photographer and occasional bassist, had been practicing and crashing here, and through Lars's many connections had been given the opportunity to contribute a song to an LA heavy metal compilation record on Metal Blade Records. They had enlisted a competent lead guitar player by the name of Lloyd Grant, but he had trouble making the rehearsals, and so entered Dave Mustaine. Dave came here with his gear and he set up and he started warming up, and the other gentleman had retired to the other room, and they were nowhere to be found. So when Dave went in there, he saw them watching TV and drinking peppermint schnapps, and he said, "Hey, do you want to audition me?" And Lars nonchalantly just waved his hand and said, "No, you got the gig." But Dave Mustaine was unlike any other musician they had ever played with. He was ridiculously confident, and I mean trash-talking in your face confident. And Dave had good gear, he had great gear, and he knew how to play, and he had actually played real live gigs before. Anyways, right here, Ron McGovney's Rehearsal Space Garage.
Located here on this Anaheim, California street at what is now a completely nondescript storage facility were two small clubs, the Woodstock and the even smaller Radio City. And on March 14th, 1982, Metallica played their very first show at Radio City. The band had settled on the name Metallica, and as a matter of fact, James Hetfield had designed the Metallica logo on a notepad, and it is still pretty much exactly the one they still use today. For the Metal Blade Metal Massacre compilation, they somewhat crudely recorded an original song, Hit the Lights, on a 4-track Tascam, and if nothing else, it showcases the speed and the precision the band would become famous for. But for all intents and purposes, that first gig was a disaster. Dave Mustaine's broken strings, James Hetfield's total lack of stage banner, and a setlist that, besides Hit the Lights, consisted almost completely of cover songs. But Metallica was unfazed and set their sights on securing the opening slot for one of their hero bands that were coming to play the world-famous Whiskey A Go-Go in Hollywood, and that band was Saxon.
In March of '81, Metallica had recorded a 2-song demo tape and went about trying to book shows with an emphasis on getting the opening slot for the upcoming Saxon dates here at the Whiskey A Go-Go. So Ron McGovney had actually attended a few shows here at the Whiskey, so of course he was elected to pitch the tape. But as he stood on the corner right here trying to work up his nerve to go in, as fate would have it, he ran into Nikki Sixx and Vince Neil, who lived right up there in that apartment building. I think it's 1140 Clark Street. They recognized Ron from photographing one of their gigs, and of course they asked him if he had any blow. He told them why he was here, and they walked him right in and talked him up to the Whiskey staff, and they did get the gig. The ironic part is that Ron McGovney, who was largely responsible for moving them up the local band ladder, was being replaced behind his back. You know, Ron McGovney was the only member of the band with any outside interests, and his less than rabid devotion to everything Metallica was being questioned by the other members of the band, and it kind of left him on the outs. But anyways, everything's fair in love and war and rock and roll. By 1983, there were two distinct heavy metal disciplines forming: the hair metal bands in LA, who wore their hair up, and the San Francisco bands who wore their hair down and played more of a thrash metal. After a couple forays up here to San Francisco, where they played for a much more sophisticated and raucous metal audience, the band knew it was finally time to ditch Ron McGovney and pull the trigger on a Bay Area bassist that was currently playing in a band called Trauma named Cliff Burton. Cliff Burton was a more trained musician than the other members of Metallica, but he'd given that certain San Francisco street cred that they were looking for. It wouldn't be an easy sell. Trauma was a fairly popular band, but unbeknownst to them, Cliff had become disillusioned with them because he felt they were getting too commercial. But finally, after several phone conversations, he agreed to join, but under one condition. Metallica would have to relocate here to San Francisco, but as Lars liked to joke, we had our bags packed before we hung up the phone. So now we're in the East Bay suburb of El Cerrito. We're virtually a couple blocks down from where John Fogerty was born and raised. And this, of course, is a Metallica Mansion. And this very nondescript house would become one of the most infamous in the party scene in the Bay Area, the thrash metal party scene. And it earned Metallica the name Alcoholica right here. But Lars and James moved in, and it wasn't long before they had soundproofed the garage, and they were rehearsing in it virtually every night that they weren't gigging. They were developing as players, but also as songwriters, and Lars was making leaps and bounds behind the drums, and James Hetfield had developed a ultra-fast, very staccato right hand. It was one of the best on the thrash scene. The band was playing ever more packed shows, in no small part due to the underground demo tape, No Life to Leather, and was making its way throughout the metal community via homemade cassette tapes. There was an authenticity to Metallica that not a lot of other bands had, and it wasn't long before they were at the very top of the West Coast thrash metal heat. Metallica Mansion, right here. By 1983, the Bay Area thrash scene had taken off, and the bands had all become very tight, playing and partying together. Metallica shared bills with bands like Testament, Death Angel, and an East Bay metal band called Exodus and their lead guitarist, Kirk Hammett. This is the former location of the Stone right here, and in March of 1983, Metallica played their first gig with bassist Cliff Burton. They also did gigs right here. This used to be the Mabuhay Gardens right over here. It was a punk club first. A lot of thrash shows there too, though. Although Dave Mustaine was a major part of why Metallica had become so popular, his behavior and demeanor, especially when drinking, was becoming an issue with the other members. There was a bit of a power struggle, and it didn't help that the debauched partying and alcohol consumption had reached epic proportions. But it was right about this time that the band received a fateful offer from a record store owner on the East Coast for $1,500 to come and play some gigs in New York, the Stone.
So the band rented a 24-foot U-Haul and set out cross-country from California to the East Coast. And what began with total dreams of rock stardom within hours disintegrated into a miserable, sniping, booze-fueled trek. Mark Whitaker was serving as road manager, and only 3 people could sit up front in the U-Haul at a time. The other 2 were regulated to the locked-up cargo portion of the van, where it was either freezing or stiflingly hot, and I would imagine pitch black. By this time, James and Lars had tired of Dave Mustaine's constant verbal one-upmanship, and it didn't help that on one of Dave's driving shifts, he hit a patch of ice and had gotten into an accident, which, unbeknownst to Dave Mustaine, was the last straw, and despite the genius of his guitar playing, the rest of the band had had enough. They arrived in Brunswick, New Jersey, and spent a few days at their benefactor Johnny Zazula's house. Johnny and his wife Marcia were record store owners who had become central figures in the underground metal tape trading network that had developed on the East Coast. But Metallica was proving a mite too rowdy, and Johnny Z found them a rehearsal space in Jamaica, Queens, New York, at what was called the Music Building. The squalid room there served as their home for the next few months, and they lived out of a cooler on nothing more than packages of bologna and beer. But they were able to practice and start playing well-received gigs, and became fast friends with fellow Music Building residents Anthrax. One morning after some particularly hard partying, Dave Mustaine woke up to find the other band members standing over him. He asked what was up, and Lars flatly told him that he was out of the band. They handed him a bus ticket, drove him to the bus station with basically just the clothes on his back and not $1 to his name. And on the very same day, Exodus guitarist Kirk Hammett was flown in from San Francisco and offered the job, and the classic Metallica lineup was finally set.
Kirk Hammett was a Bay Area native, an avid horror comic collector since childhood, and had been playing guitar since he was 15. And as a matter of fact, as a young teen, he sold off his beloved horror comic collection to finance his new love of everything rock and roll metal. In 1979, when he was still in high school, Kirk co-founded Exodus, who were to become one of the founding agents of the San Francisco thrash metal movement. And Exodus had played a few gigs with Metallica, and Kirk was very friendly with them, considering they both shared road manager Mark Whitaker, and Kirk was a regular at Mark's house at Metallica Mansion. So when Mark Whitaker called and told him that Mustaine was on his way out, Kirk found a way to get his hands on No Life to Leather, which was their demo tape, and he learned all the songs. When he finally did get the call, he scraped up the money for a plane flight, which, by the way, was the first time he was ever outside of California.
After booking some New York shows opening for Venom, Johnny Z could finally see Metallica's full potential, and since there was zero interest from a major label in signing them, he found a way to come up with the $15,000 to record at Music America Studios in the unlikely upstate New York city of Rochester. The album would take 2 weeks to record, and when they were done, everything would change. Johnny Z would form Megaforce Records, and Kill 'Em All, whose album cover was inspired by Cliff Burton's strange habit of carrying a hammer around with him, would become one of American heavy metal's first breakthrough thrash records. Metallica was on their way, and unbeknownst to them at the time, they were spearheading an entire movement.
So by 1986, Metallica had signed with Elektra Records and released their seminal album, Master of Puppets. Still thrash metal, but with a sense of song and melody that had pop sensibility and done in a genuinely brutal and heavy metal way. Anyways, without going into too much detail, in September of '86, while on tour, their bus crashed and turned over in Sweden, and it killed bassist Cliff Burton. Cliff Burton was the most well-liked and studious member of the band. And if you ask just about everyone, they'd tell you he was the heart and soul of the band. And to this day, I don't feel that Metallica has totally gotten over his death. So Metallica did what rock bands tend to do when faced with grief and tragedy. They immediately booked a tour and went about finding a replacement for the irreplaceable Cliff Burton, which brings us here. This is Tommy's joint, and it's been here since 1947. Bassist Jason Newsted was a big fan of Metallica, and after they had auditioned 60 other bassists, they brought him here to do a practice hang. So Lars, James, and Kirk found themselves in the restroom at the same time, and they discussed things. They came back down here, and they asked Jason if he needed a job. And so began the next chapter for Metallica. So in October of 1990, just as grunge rock was taking the world by storm, Metallica came here to North Hollywood to the studio, 101 Studios, and began recording their eponymously titled album Metallica, which is better known as the Black Album. And they enlisted the services of producer Bob Rock, who had previously done some records for Motley Crue. They liked the sound he was getting. And the key thing Bob Rock brought was his insistence that they cut the basic tracks playing live in a room together instead of their usual overdubbing of everything separately. And that, along with getting them to agree to background harmony vocals, and this album had a commercial edge to it that nothing like it ever had before. After its release in 1991, the Black Album gained enough traction in the pop charts that the band found themselves defending their work to the metal purists who were now accusing them of selling out, much the same way as the Folkies had once turned on Bob Dylan for going electric. But with songs like Enter Sandman and Nothing Else Matters, the album went #1, and I don't think anything as genuinely heavy has ever made it there before. I could be wrong. But anyways, 101 Recorders, North Hollywood, California. You know, Metallica's history from the Black Album forward has been the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. There's been rehabs and Napster and more rehabs. Jason was replaced by Robert Trujillo, and the entire way they've continued to put out new music, and I think they're still probably one of the top couple live acts in the entire world. So I do think it's fitting that we talk about Metallica's 2009 induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame next to this Cliff Burton plaque right here on Broadway, next to the most infamous strip club in San Francisco. In 2009, when Metallica was inducted, they invited all the past members, Jason Newsted, Ron McGovney, and even Lloyd Grant. Interestingly, original guitarist Dave Mustaine was nowhere to be found, and I actually thought he should have been inducted with the band, but I guess being the leader of Megadeth does have its perks. But I think the most poignant moment of the induction occurred when James Hetfield finished with, "I'd like to thank Lars Ulrich for calling me all those years ago and including me in his dream to form the biggest heavy metal band in the world." Anyways, I'd like to thank all the members of Metallica for your great music and your epic story. And it's at this point in the show where I'd like to shamelessly ask for your subscription. We also have a pretty cool back library. If you like classic rock, I think you'll enjoy it. For Tim, be kind to one another. Peace out. Bye-bye.